I knew something was wrong the moment he smiled while I was crying, because we were standing in our kitchen late at night after another argument that somehow turned into him calmly explaining to me why I was the problem again. And when I told him I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, he nodded like a doctor confirming a diagnosis and said maybe that was something I should finally admit out loud. And the terrifying part was how natural it sounded coming from him, like he had been waiting for me to say it, like this was a box he needed checked. And that was the second I realized this wasn't about fixing us anymore. This was about making sure nobody would believe me once I figured out what he was really doing. Before I take you to the beginning, tell me in the comments which city or state you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so I can bring you even more intense stories. I want to be very clear about something before I go any further, because I know how these stories usually sound when people tell them online. Everyone says they missed red flags. Everyone says they ignored their gut. Everyone says they were blind. But the truth is I wasn't blind. I was busy trying to be a good wife. And that's the part people never talk about. Because when you're focused on keeping the peace, you stop questioning things that don't immediately explode. And my husband knew that about me better than anyone. When we first got married, he wasn't cruel, he wasn't cold, and he definitely wasn't obvious. He was logical. He was the kind of man people trusted within minutes of meeting him. Friends described him as grounded. Family said I was lucky because he was so steady. And I believed that too, because compared to my own emotions, he did seem steady. I was expressive. I talked things through. I cried when I was overwhelmed. He listened, nodded, and always seemed to have an explanation that made sense. At least, it made sense at the time. The first shift was so small I didn't even register it as a shift. It started with disagreements where the ending always felt strange. We would argue about something simple, like a conversation we had or a plan we made, and by the end of it, I would feel confused instead of resolved. Not angry, not satisfied, just confused. I would walk away thinking I needed to calm down, that I was overreacting, that maybe I remembered it wrong. Remembered. He began correcting my memory casually, not aggressively, not in a way that would trigger alarm bells. Just enough to make me doubt myself. I would say we agreed to visit my parents that weekend, and he would tilt his head and say no, we talked about going the following week. I would swear we had the conversation, and he would smile gently and say, I must be mixing it up with another time. That smile did more damage than yelling ever could, because it made me feel foolish for pushing back. Every couple disagrees, so I didn't think much of it at first. But it kept happening. With plans, with things I was sure about. I started deferring to him. If there was a disagreement, I would pause and think maybe he was right. Maybe my stress was messing with my head. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was too emotional. The next phase didn't happen in private. It happened in front of other people. We would be out with friends, and I would tell a story about something that happened at home, and he would laugh softly and say that wasn't exactly how it went. Not in a confrontational way. In a charming way, people would laugh. Someone would say couples remember things differently, and I would smile and nod, even though my stomach would twist because I knew what I remembered. After a while, he started adding commentary. Little comments that framed me a certain way. He would say things like Shess been stressed lately, or Shess had a lot on her plate, or she gets overwhelmed easily. Nothing that sounded cruel on the surface. In fact, it sounded caring. But I noticed something strange. People started responding to me differently. When I spoke, they looked at him first. When I disagreed, they looked uncomfortable. When I got emotional, it felt like it confirmed something they already believed. At home, I tried to talk to him about it. I told him it made me uncomfortable when he corrected me in front of others. He looked genuinely surprised. He said he was just trying to help. He said he didn't realize it bothered me. He said I might be projecting because I was already feeling insecure. And somehow, that conversation ended with me apologizing for being sensitive. That became the pattern. Any issue I raised turned into evidence that something was wrong with me. If I said I felt dismissed, he said I was defensive. If I said I felt confused, he said I was anxious. If I said I needed clarity, he said I was spiraling. He never said I was crazy. He never used that word. He didn't need to. He was building something far more effective. The real turning point came when I started noticing gaps. Actual gaps. Conversations I couldn't fully recall. Decisions I didn't remember agreeing to. Times where I would find myself reacting emotionally without being able to pinpoint exactly why. That scared me. Not because of him, but because of me. I started Googling symptoms late at night. Stress, anxiety, memory issues. I wondered if something was wrong with my brain. I told him I was worried. I told him I felt off. And this is where his behavior changed in a way that still makes my skin crawl. He became supportive. He suggested therapy. He offered to help me find someone to talk to. He said he just wanted me to feel better. And again, it all sounded reasonable. But I didn't realize at the time that he had already started telling other people a different story. I found that out by accident. One afternoon, I ran into one of his co-workers at the grocery store. We made small talk. Then she paused and asked me gently if I was doing okay. I laughed and asked what she meant. She hesitated, then said my husband had mentioned I had been under a lot of stress lately and that things had been hard for me. I felt my face burn, not because I was embarrassed, but because I hadn't known he was sharing that. When I confronted him about it, he didn't deny it. He said he was just concerned. He said he needed support too. He said he didn't go into detail. And then he asked me why I was so upset about people knowing I was struggling. He asked if I was ashamed of myself. That question shut me down completely. From that point on, I started watching more closely. And once I started watching, I couldn't stop seeing it. He would have phone calls in another room and lower his voice when I walked by. He would text during arguments and then put his phone face down. He started keeping notes. Actual notes. Lists. I once saw a notebook open on his desk with dates and short phrases that looked like reminders. He said it was work-related. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. At the same time, my confidence was slipping away. I stopped trusting my reactions. I stopped bringing things up. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. And every time I swallowed something that bothered me, he seemed more relaxed. Happier. Like the house was finally calm in the way he preferred. Then came the night that still loops in my head, no matter how hard I might have moved past it. We had another argument. I don't even remember what started it, and that's what scares me the most. I remember raising my voice. I remember crying. I remember telling him I felt like I was disappearing. And I remember him standing there, arms crossed, watching me like I was proving something. At some point, he walked away. I assumed he needed space. I sat on the couch trying to steady my breathing. A little while later, there was a knock at the door. I opened it, still shaking, and saw the police officers standing there. My heart dropped into my stomach. They asked if everything was okay. Before I could answer, my husband stepped forward and said calmly that I had been having a rough night and he was worried about me. He said I had been sending frantic messages. He said he was afraid I might hurt myself. None of that was true. But he said it with such confidence that I froze. I tried to explain. I tried to speak clearly. But my voice was shaking and I could feel the panic rising, and I could see it in their eyes. The way they assessed me versus him. Calm husband. Emotional wife. It didn't matter what I said. The narrative was already written. Eventually, they left. No report. No escalation. Just a warning to take care of myself and consider getting help. When the door closed, I turned to him and asked him why he did that. He looked at me with something close to pity and said, he was just trying to keep me safe. That was the first time I really felt afraid of him. Not because he yelled. Not because he hit me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there replaying every conversation from the past year, wondering how many times he had documented my reactions, how many times he had shared his version of events with other people, how long he had been laying the groundwork. The next morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He made coffee. He asked if I wanted breakfast. He told me he loved me. And I looked at him across the table and realized I didn't know who I was married to anymore. What I didn't know then was that this was still the beginning. And that everything I had seen so far was just preparation for something much worse. Because a few days later, I would discover that he hadn't just been telling people I was unstable. He had been preparing proof. And I was about to find out exactly how far he was willing to go to erase me. I didn't find the proof all at once. And that's important. Because if I had stumbled on everything in a single moment, I probably would have broken down or confronted him too early and ruined whatever chance I had to understand the full picture. But instead it came in pieces, small enough that I could still function, but disturbing enough that once I saw the first one I couldn't stop looking for the rest. It started with my phone. One morning I woke up and noticed a message thread open that I didn't remember opening. It was with my sister. The last message, supposedly from me, said I was overwhelmed and didn't know what was real anymore. That wasn't something I would ever send her. Not like that. I scrolled up and saw more messages. My stomach dropped. I checked the timestamps. They were from the night the police came. The same night I had been crying on the couch while he disappeared into the bedroom. I confronted him immediately. I asked him if he had sent messages from my phone. He didn't deny touching it. He said he was worried and thought it would help if my sister knew what was going on. He said he didn't change my words, just clarified how I was feeling. That sentence still makes me sick. Clarified how I was feeling, as if he had the authority to define my emotions better than I did. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab my phone and run. But instead, I froze. Because if he could do that so calmly, so confidently, then how much else had he already done? I started checking everything. My email, my call logs. And slowly, patterns started to appear. Missed calls I didn't remember ignoring. Appointments I didn't remember scheduling. Notes I didn't remember writing. It felt like my life had fingerprints on it that weren't mine. At first, I wondered if maybe something really was wrong with me. That's how deep the manipulation had gone. Even with evidence in front of me, my instinct was still to doubt myself. That's what gaslighting does. It doesn't just make you question reality. It makes you question your right to question it. I decided not to confront him again. Not yet. Something in me shifted that day. A quiet switch flipped. I realized that reacting emotionally was exactly what he wanted. He needed me unstable. He needed me frantic. So I stopped giving him that. Instead, I started observing. I paid attention to when he used my phone. I noticed how often he asked where it was. I started locking it. When he realized I'd changed the password, he laughed and said it was probably a good idea. He said I deserved privacy. But later that night, he asked if I was feeling paranoid again. He wrapped it in concern, just like always. Then there were the emails. I found drafts in my email account addressed to his parents. Drafts I never wrote. Drafts explaining that I was struggling mentally and that I didn't want them to worry. Some of them weren't even sent. They were just there, saved like placeholders. Like he was preparing for a moment when he would need them. That's when the fear really set in. Because this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't him reacting to a bad argument. This was organized. strategic. He was losing control. He was exercising it. I started sleeping lightly. I kept my phone under my pillow. I began writing things down in a notebook I hid in my car. Dates. Conversations. Exact phrases he used. I didn't know what I was going to do with the information yet. I just knew I needed it. Because something deep inside me was screaming that one day, I would need proof of my own sanity. The more I pulled back emotionally, the more irritated he became. Not openly. He started pushing, making comments designed to provoke me, bringing up things he knew would hurt. And when I didn't react the way he expected, I could see the frustration flicker across his face before he masked it with that same calm smile. One night he told me he had scheduled an appointment for me with a therapist. He didn't ask. He told me. He said he thought it would help, especially since I had been forgetting things and having emotional swings. I asked him how he knew that. He said I told him. I asked when. He said I didn't remember, which only proved his point. I went to the appointment. Not because I believed him, but because I needed to know how far this went. The therapist was kind, professional. She asked questions. And as I answered them, I realized something else horrifying. He had already spoken to her. He had given her context. His context. I could tell by the way she framed her questions, by the assumptions baked into them. I felt like I was walking into a room where the verdict had already been discussed. I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I spoke calmly. I explained my concerns. And at the end of the session, she said something that chilled me. She said it sounded like I had a supportive partner who was worried about me. I left feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. That night, I sat alone in the bathroom and cried silently so he wouldn't hear me. Not because I was weak, but because I finally understood the scope of what I was dealing with. He was trying to leave me. He was trying to erase me, not physically, socially, legally, psychologically. He wanted a version of the story where I disappeared on my own. A few days later, I overheard something I wasn't supposed to. He was on the phone in his office with the door partially closed. I walked by and heard my name. I stopped. I didn't mean to listen. He was talking to someone, his voice low, steady. He said things like it was getting worse and he was doing everything he could. He said he was documenting everything. He said he just wanted to protect himself in case things escalated. Protect himself. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about concern. This was about positioning. He was preparing for a moment when he could say, I tried to help her. And everyone would nod along. I went back to the bedroom and sat on the bed, staring at the wall. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. I knew then that I couldn't confront him head-on. I couldn't explode. I couldn't panic. I had to survive long enough to understand the rules of the game he was playing. So I started doing something that felt wrong but necessary. I let him think it was working. I agreed with him more. I apologized when he said I was defensive. I thanked him for being patient with me. I even mentioned therapy sessions casually, the way he liked. And every time I did, I watched his shoulders relax. I watched his confidence grow. He started acting like he had already won. But what he didn't know was that while he was documenting my supposed instability, I was documenting his control. I took screenshots of the drafts. I saved call logs. I forwarded emails to an account he didn't know existed. I kept notes of every time he used my phone. I memorized dates. I stayed quiet. It was on his computer. At least, that's what I told myself. I was looking for a file he had asked me to send for him. When I opened the documents folder, I saw one labeled with my name. Just my name. My heart started racing. Inside were screenshots, messages, notes. I carefully organized record of moments where I had cried, raised my voice, questioned him. each one framed as evidence. Evidence of what? I didn't know yet. But I could feel the walls closing in. At the top of one document was a heading that made my vision blur. Contingency plan. I closed the laptop so fast my hands hurt, trying not to scream. Because in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. He wasn't reacting to me anymore. He was waiting. And whatever he was waiting for was going to destroy me if I didn't move first. I just didn't know yet how close I already was to losing everything. The moment I closed that laptop, the one with the folder carrying my name like a label on a body bag, I didn't feel panic the way I expected to. Instead, what settled in was something colder and heavier, like my mind finally stopped trying to protect the version of him I wanted to believe in. And once that happened, everything else came into focus so fast it almost made me dizzy. Because suddenly every conversation from the past year replayed itself differently. Every calm tone sounded rehearsed. And the scariest realization of all was that none of this had started recently. This had been unfolding quietly while I was still trying to save a marriage he had already replaced with a strategy. I sat there for a long time after closing the computer, not moving, not breathing deeply, just listening to the house, because I needed my body to catch up with what my brain already knew, which was that this was no longer about love or misunderstanding or even control in the way people usually talk about it. This was about narrative ownership, and he had been writing mine for months without me even realizing I had lost the pen. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid he would hurt me physically, but because I was afraid of how easily he could hurt me without touching me at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words contingency plan, and I kept wondering how many versions of my future he had already prepared. How many exits he had planned that ended with him walking away clean while I was left explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. The next morning, I woke up before him, which was unusual, and I watched him sleep for a moment longer than I should have, trying to reconcile the man lying there with the man who had catalogued my emotional reactions like symptoms. And for the first time since we met, I felt no connection at all, just distance, like I was already standing on the other side of something irreversible. I went about the morning normally. Coffee, breakfast, small talk. He asked how I was feeling. I said better. He smiled. That smile was important, because it told me something else I needed to know. He thought the pressure was working. He thought I was bending. Over the next several days, I became someone else entirely, at least on the surface. I agreed with him more. I deferred. I let him finish my sentences. And every time I did, I watched him relax just a little more, like a man settling into a chair he believed was finally his. Meanwhile, I was collecting everything. I waited for moments when he felt safest. When he believed I was compliant. When he believed he no longer needed to hide as carefully. That's when I went back to the folder. This time, I didn't rush. I opened each document slowly, reading not just the words, but the intent behind them. There were timelines detailing arguments I barely remembered because they had been reframed so thoroughly. There were notes describing my tone, my posture, my facial expressions. There were even references to moments I hadn't realized mattered at all. Like times I had gone quiet or withdrawn, moments he interpreted as dissociation rather than exhaustion. He had turned my humanity into pathology. One document stood out more than the others. It was labeled progression. Inside, he had charted what he believed was my decline. Escalation. Increased emotional volatility. Memory inconsistencies. Resistance to guidance. Each section ended with recommendations. Therapy. Monitoring. Documentation. Legal consultation if necessary. Legal. That word sat in my chest like a weight. As I continued digging, I found something else. Emailed drafts to a lawyer that included attachments from the folder. He had already prepared the evidence. He just hadn't sent it yet. And that told me something critical. He was waiting for the right moment, not reacting. I copied everything, every file, every draft. I didn't just save them. I duplicated them across multiple locations. I sent them to an email account he didn't know existed. I stored them on a drive that never stayed in the house. I treated each piece like something I might one day need to prove that I was still myself. While I was doing this, his behavior escalated again. He stopped pretending as much. In public, he became more overt. He interrupted me mid-sentence. He corrected me sharply instead of gently. He made jokes about my stress that were no longer wrapped in concern. People laughed awkwardly. Some looked uncomfortable. But the seed he had planted earlier meant no one challenged him. At home, he began testing boundaries more aggressively. He questioned where I had been. He asked why I was locking my phone. He suggested I was becoming secretive. And every time I pushed back even slightly, he leaned into the narrative he had built, asking if I was feeling overwhelmed again, if I needed to take a break, if I was spiraling. I learned quickly that reacting was exactly what he wanted. So I stopped giving him reactions he could use. Instead, I documented. I wrote down the exact phrases he used. The timing. I noticed how often his comments came right before or right after he spoke to someone else. Like he was laying groundwork and then reinforcing it. One night, I overheard him on the phone again. This time, I didn't freeze. He was speaking to someone I couldn't identify at first. His tone was calm, measured, sympathetic. He talked about how hard it was to love someone who was slipping away. He talked about responsibility, about protecting assets. Protecting assets. That phrase confirmed what I had already suspected. This wasn't just about my mental state. This was about control over outcomes. Financial, social. The next day, my mother called me. She asked gentle questions. She told me she was worried. She said my husband had mentioned he'd been having trouble sleeping, trouble remembering things. I asked her when he had said that. She hesitated. Then said it had come up naturally. Naturally. I hung up the phone and sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, not crying, not shaking, just absorbing the fact that he had successfully reached into my family and altered how they saw me. That was the moment I stopped being passive. I knew I needed an outside witness, someone he had not prepped, someone he could not influence, someone who would see the situation clearly without the fog he had carefully created. I chose my cousin because she was distant enough to be outside his circle, but close enough to know me well. When I told her everything, I didn't dramatize it. I laid it out chronologically. I showed her evidence. I explained patterns. I watched her expression shift from curiosity to concern to something sharper. She said exactly what I needed to hear. This is deliberate. Those 2 words grounded me more than any therapy session ever could. Because deliberate meant intention, and intention meant vulnerability. No plan survives exposure. From that point on, we worked quietly. We prepared contingencies of our own. Where I would go if things escalated. What documents I needed immediate access to. Who I could contact if he tried to force an evaluation. We discussed worst-case scenarios without panic, without emotion, because emotion had already been weaponized against me once. And then he made his boldest move yet. One evening, after dinner, he asked me to sit down. His voice was calm, practiced. He told me he had been thinking a lot about my well-being. He said he loved me. He said he was scared for me. And then he told me he had scheduled an evaluation. Not therapy. Not counseling. An evaluation. He framed it as a step toward clarity. Toward relief. Toward proving that everything was fine. But I could hear the script underneath it. The setup. I asked who had suggested it. He said professionals. I asked which ones. He said names I recognized from the drafts, from the emails, from the folder. That's when I knew the timeline had accelerated. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I told him I needed time to think. He agreed easily. Too easily. He smiled and said he was proud of me for being open-minded. That smile told me everything. He believed he had cornered me. That night, I packed quietly. I didn't take much. Only what I absolutely needed. Documents. Essentials. I waited until he was asleep. Then I left without a note, without a message, without a goodbye. I went somewhere he would not expect. And as my phone began to buzz with messages from him asking where I was, messages that quickly shifted from concern to irritation, I understood that the version of me he had built only worked as long as I stayed in the role. The moment I stepped out of it, the story would change. And when it did, everyone would finally see who he really was. What I didn't know yet was how fast he would try to regain control, and how far he would be willing to go once he realized I wasn't playing along anymore. Leaving the house that night didn't feel like escape. It felt like finally stepping out of a room where the air had been slowly thinning without me realizing it. And the strange part was that once I was gone, once the door closed behind me, I didn't feel relief the way people expect in these stories. I felt alert, like every sense in my body had finally switched on at the same time, because I understood that from that moment forward, every move I made would either protect me or hand him exactly what he wanted. I didn't go somewhere dramatic. I didn't want a hotel receipt or a strange location showing up later in some story he could twist. I went somewhere boring and predictable because bore an narrative of instability, and by then I was thinking entirely in terms of narratives, not emotions, not fairness. The first thing I did was turn my phone off, not permanently, just long enough to give myself a few hours without reaction. Because I knew the moment he realized I was gone, the messages would start, and I wanted to see them clearly, not through panic, not through guilt, but through strategy. When I turned the phone back on, the messages were already there, lined up exactly the way I expected. Starting soft, starting careful, starting concerned, asking where I was, asking if I was safe, telling me he loved me, and that told me something important right away, which was that he still believed concern was his strongest tool. I didn't answer. After some time passed, the wording changed. Not suddenly, but gradually, like he was testing how far he could push without losing the image he had built. And that's when the questions started turning into statements. Statements like leaving without telling him wasn't healthy, like disappearing proved something, like running away made things worse. And every sentence carried the same underlying message, which was that my absence was not a choice, it was a symptom. I stayed silent, and that silence did something I could feel through the screen. Because the timing of his messages began to tighten, the gaps between them getting shorter, the tone becoming sharper, less polished. And then came the line that confirmed everything I had already learned about him. "You are proving everyone right." That sentence wasn't about me. It was about the audience he had already prepared. The invisible crowd he had been speaking to for months without my knowledge. And the fact that he said everyone told me exactly how confident he had been that the story would hold. I showed the messages to my cousin, and instead of talking about how upsetting they were, we talked about how they functioned. Because by then we both understood that feelings were irrelevant in a situation built on narrative control. And what stood out immediately was how predictable the progression was. Concern turning into confusion, confusion into irritation, irritation into blame. That mattered, because predictability meant pattern, and pattern meant intention. The next decision I made was not emotional. It was practical, and it was long overdue. I contacted a lawyer. Not because I wanted revenge yet. Not because I wanted to file anything, but because I needed someone who understood how stories become records. And records become truth when nobody challenges them early enough. The consultation was uncomfortable in the best possible way, because she didn't ask how I felt. She asked what I could prove. And when I walked her through everything from the beginning, the corrections, the gaslighting, the police visit, the therapist appointment scheduled without my consent, the messages sent from my phone, the drafts, the folder, the contingency plan. I watched her expression shift from neutral to focused in a way that told me this was far more serious than I had even allowed myself to admit. She said something that grounded me immediately. This is preparation, not reaction. She explained that the most dangerous situations weren't explosive. They were quiet, because quiet preparation allows someone to control perception long before anyone realizes a conflict exists. And by the time the other person reacts, the ground has already been shaped underneath them. She told me leaving the house whilst running away, it was interrupting a timeline. That sentence stayed with me, because timelines can be disrupted, but only once. She also told me something else. Something I didn't want to hear but needed to. Expect retaliation, not emotional retaliation, not shouting or threats right away, but strategic moves designed to reassert control. And she was very clear about one thing. The moment he realized I was no longer accessible physically, he would look for other ways to access me socially and professionally. She was right. Within days, I found out he had contacted my workplace, not through him. Careful, the kind of language that sounds reasonable until you realize how damaging it is when it isn't true. I didn't panic. I prepared. I didn't bring everything. I brought enough: messages, timelines, proof of third-party contact, proof that there was an ongoing legal consultation, because accusations sound unstable, but documentation sounds grounded. Walking into that meeting felt surreal, because I knew exactly what version of me they were expecting, and I was determined not to give it to them. I spoke calmly. I answered questions clearly. I explained that there was a personal conflict in that boundaries had been crossed, and slowly, not dramatically, but noticeably, I felt the assumptions in the room shift. After that meeting, his messages changed again. The concern disappeared completely. Now it was irritation, sharp-clipped, accusing me of escalating things, accusing me of involving people unnecessarily, accusing me of making things worse, and that reaction told me something important. If he truly believed I was unstable, neutral oversight would have supported his narrative. The fact that it angered him meant it threatened it. A few days later, the paperwork arrived. He formally requested an evaluation. Not therapy, not counseling. An evaluation. The language was clinical, detached, careful, citing concern, referencing patterns, attaching documentation from his folder, and reading it felt like reading a report written about someone else who happened to share my name. But this time I wasn't alone. My lawyer responded immediately. We submitted counter-documentation. Not emotional rebuttals, but timelines, logs, proof that messages attributed to me were sent while my phone was secured. Proof that drafts existed before incidents he claimed they responded to. Proof that his documentation followed a narrative instead of reality. And that's where something shifted. Because consistency can survive emotion, but it cannot survive scrutiny. As the process moved forward, cracks started to appear, not publicly yet, but quietly. Dates that didn't line up, claims that didn't match records, contexts that fell apart under basic verification. And the more he tried to reinforce his story, the more rigid it became. And rigidity is always the first sign of collapse. Then something happened that neither of us anticipated. A mutual friend reached out to me privately. She said she had felt uncomfortable with his behavior toward me for a long time, but didn't know how to describe it. She said she remembered him speaking about my mental state months before I ever showed visible distress. She said she had messages from him expressing frustration that I wasn't reacting the way he expected, and that mattered more than any document ever could, because it showed intent. As that information entered the picture, his tone shifted again. Colder, shorter, less controlled, accusing me of turning people against him, accusing me of twisting the story, accusing me of betrayal. And for the first time, The calm mask he had worn so carefully started slipping in ways other people could see. Then came the threat. He said if I didn't cooperate, things would get ugly. He said he had been holding back. He said once everything was public, people wouldn't be so understanding. And reading that message, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. Because threats are honesty. I forwarded the message to my lawyer. That message marked the end of his controlled phase. From that point forward, he stopped pretending to be reasonable. He told people I had abandoned him. He implied instability openly. He framed himself as a victim dealing with an unpredictable partner, but something had already changed beneath the surface. People were asking questions, quiet ones, careful ones. And uncertainty is dangerous for someone whose power depends on everyone believing the same story. I could feel that he was running out of options. And when someone like him runs out of options, they don't retreat. They make one last move. The shift after that threat was immediate, not because he suddenly became reckless, but because he became impatient. And impatience is always louder than planning, because once someone believes time is running out, they stop polishing their words and start revealing their intent. And that's exactly what happened next. Within days, people I hadn't spoken to in months started reaching out to me with carefully worded messages that all carried the same underlying tone. Checking in, asking if I was okay, saying they had heard things unwanted to make sure I had support. And I didn't need to ask what they had heard because the structure of their concern told me everything. It was confirmation seeking, like they had already been told a version of the story and were measuring my responses against it. I didn't over-explain. I didn't defend myself. I answered calmly. Briefly. I thanked them for checking in and said I was dealing with a private legal matter and had support. No emotion. No justification. Because justification feeds narratives, and I was done feeding his. Behind the scenes, my lawyer was working quietly, requesting records, clarifying timelines, placing markers in places he didn't expect. And the more formal the process became, the more erratic his behavior grew. Not in public yet, but in private messages that grew sharper and less controlled. He accused me of poisoning people against him. He accused me of rewriting history. He accused me of manipulating the situation to make him look bad. And every accusation told on him. Because someone confident in their story doesn't panic when others ask questions. Then came the meeting I didn't expect but had prepared for anyway. He requested mediation. Framed as an attempt to resolve things peacefully. Framed as concern for my well-being. Framed as a desire for clarity. But I knew what mediation meant to him. It meant another room where he could perform calm reasonableness while subtly framing me as emotional and unreliable. I agreed, not because I trusted the process, but because I trusted my preparation. The day of the mediation, I walked in with my lawyer beside me. And the moment I saw his face, I knew he hadn't expected that. Not the lawyer, not the posture, not the calm, because for months he had been preparing for a version of me that would arrive defensive or overwhelmed. And instead I arrived quiet, grounded, and uninterested in performing. He spoke first. He talked about love, about concern, about how hard it had been watching me struggle, about how he only wanted to help, about how he feared for my safety. And he said all of it in a tone that would have sounded compassionate to anyone who didn't know what to listen for. Then my lawyer spoke. She didn't attack him. She didn't accuse him. She asked questions, specific ones, about timelines, about drafts, about messages sent without my consent. About why documentation existed before incidents he claimed they responded to. And that's when I saw it. The hesitation. Not panic. Not anger. Just a split second where he had to think instead of perform. And in that split second, the image cracked. He answered carefully. His responses grew longer. More detailed. More rigid. He circled back to the same phrases again and again. Concern, safety, responsibility, and repetition is always a sign someone is trying to anchor a story that no longer feels stable. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about how hurt I was. I didn't talk about love or betrayal. I talked about facts. I talked about messages sent while my phone was not in my possession. I talked about drafts written before arguments occurred. I talked about notes describing my reactions instead of conversations. I talked about how often my memory was questioned only after I disagreed with him. I spoke evenly, slowly, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty in the room that did not belong to me. After that meeting, his strategy changed again. The legal angle stalled, not because it collapsed, but because it stopped working the way he expected. And when one path closed, he pivoted to another, faster and far more public. He went social. He posted vague messages online about betrayal and being married to someone you no longer recognize. He framed himself as heartbroken, confused, abandoned. And at first, people responded with sympathy, because sympathy is easy when details are vague. But then something happened that he hadn't planned for. People started connecting dots. They noticed the timing. They noticed how his posts lined up with legal actions. They noticed how often his concerns centered on control rather than care. And slowly, sympathy turned into discomfort. Behind closed doors, his messages to me escalated. He stopped pretending to care how I felt. He demanded cooperation. He accused me of ruining his reputation. He said I owed him silence. He said everything would have been fine if I had just trusted him. If I had just trusted him. Because trust was never what he wanted. Compliance was. The breaking point came during a phone call I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Not calm, not careful, angry. He said I had gone too far. He said I had embarrassed him. He said he wasn't going to play nice anymore. And then he said something that changed everything. He said I was lucky he had been protecting me, because if people knew the truth about how unstable I really was, things would get ugly fast. I saved that voicemail. That single message undid months of careful framing, because concerned doesn't sound like a threat when it's challenged. My lawyer moved quickly after that. We submitted the voicemail. We submitted message progressions showing escalation. We submitted testimony from the mutual friend who had reached out earlier. And once that information entered the official record, his tone changed again. This time it wasn't anger. It was silence. Days passed without a message. Then weeks. No concern. No accusation. No threats. Just absence. An absence in a situation like this is never peace. It's recalculation. People around him noticed too. Friends asked why he suddenly stopped talking about me. Family members questioned inconsistencies. His carefully curated narrative lost momentum. And when a narrative loses momentum, it collapses under its own weight. The last move came out of nowhere. He requested a public hearing. Not mediation. Not evaluation. Public. He framed it as transparency, as a desire to clear his name, as an opportunity for truth to come out. And I knew immediately why he wanted it. He believed he could still control a room. What he didn't realize was that control only works when everyone is hearing the story for the first time. By then, too many people had already heard both sides. I agreed to the hearing. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted finality. The night before it happened, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid, but because I was thinking about how close I had come to disappearing quietly, how close I had come to being reduced to a version of myself that would never be allowed to speak clearly again. That realization steadied me. When the day arrived, I walked into that room knowing one thing for certain. No matter what he said next, no matter how calm he sounded, no matter how carefully he chose his words, the truth no longer belonged to him alone. And the moment he realized that, everything would change. Because men like him can survive losing relationships. They cannot survive losing control of the story. And as I took my seat and looked across the room at him, I saw it in his eyes for the first time. He finally understood. This wasn't going to end the way he planned. Walking into that hearing felt nothing like the courtroom scenes people imagine. There was no drama in the air yet. No raised voices. No tension you could point to, just a room full of people pretending this was routine. And that normality was exactly what made it dangerous, because he had always thrived in rooms like this, rooms where tone mattered more than truth, where confidence could outweigh facts if no one challenged it properly. He looked calm when I saw him, not relaxed, but practiced, like someone stepping into a role he had rehearsed many times in his head. And for a brief moment I understood why this had worked for him for so long, because if you didn't know the full story, if you hadn't lived inside it, he looked like the reasonable one. The concerned one, the man who had simply been trying to help someone he loved. That illusion lasted exactly as long as it took for the process to begin. He spoke first. Of course he did. He talked about concern, about fear. He talked about how hard it had been to watch me change. He talked about sleepless nights. He talked about love. And the way he spoke was important. Because he didn't accuse me directly, he implied. He let the room fill in the blanks for him, the same way he always had. I watched faces as he spoke. Some nodded. Some looked uncertain. Some avoided looking at me entirely. Then my lawyer stood up. And instead of countering his story emotionally, she did something much more effective. She asked him to clarify, not feelings. She asked him when he first began documenting my behavior. She asked him why drafts existed before conflicts occurred. She asked him why messages attributed to me were sent while my phone records showed inactivity. Each question was calm, neutral, non-accusatory, and with each one, the room shifted slightly. He answered confidently at first, then slowly, because facts don't bend the way narratives do. He circled back to concern repeatedly. He repeated phrases. He emphasized intent over accuracy. And repetition is always a tell, because when someone no longer trusts the structure of their argument, they lean on tone instead. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't look at him. I spoke to the room. I explained how disagreements turned into memory corrections, how concern turned into documentation, how documentation turned into control. I didn't use dramatic language. I didn't describe pain. I described sequence. I explained that I had started doubting myself only after my recollection contradicted his. I explained that my emotional reactions increased only after I was repeatedly told my perception was unreliable. I explained that messages and drafts existed that I did not write. Then my lawyer presented the voicemail. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. They heard his voice change. They heard the anger. They heard the threat. And something important happened in that silence. Concern stopped sounding like concern. After that, witnesses were called. The mutual friend spoke, calmly. She explained how he had talked about my mental state long before any visible conflict. She explained how he expressed frustration that I wasn't reacting the way he expected. She didn't speculate. She quoted. Then documentation followed. Timelines, logs, comparisons. The story stopped being about who felt what. It became about who prepared what, and when. That was the moment I saw it happen. The shift. Not dramatic, not explosive, but unmistakable. People stopped looking at me as the problem they needed to manage. They started looking at him as the variable that didn't fit. His posture changed. His answers shortened. He stopped expanding on points. He stopped trying to explain motives and focused on technicalities. That's when I understood something else. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to limit damage. The hearing didn't end with a dramatic declaration. It ended with instructions, reviews, follow-ups. But the outcome had already changed, because once doubt enters a carefully controlled narrative, it never leaves. Outside the room, people didn't rush to speak to him. They spoke to each other, quietly, carefully, because power like his depends on being the center of interpretation. And he no longer was. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel relief. What I felt was distance. Emotional distance from him, from the version of myself he tried to erase, from the fear that had once defined every decision I made. That distance was freedom. Later that day, my lawyer told me something that confirmed what I had already sensed. He had withdrawn the request for evaluation. Quietly. No announcement. No explanation. Just gone. That single action said more than any apology ever could. Because people who are truly concerned aren't suddenly stop being concerned when scrutiny appears. In the days that followed, the fallout spread quietly. Friends stopped repeating his version of events. Family members asked questions he couldn't answer cleanly. The story he had relied on lost coherence. And without coherence, it lost power. The last message I ever received from him was short. He said I didn't have to do this. He said we could have handled things privately. He said I had ruined everything. I didn't respond, because by then, there was nothing left to explain. He didn't lose me that day. He lost control of who I was allowed to be in other people's minds. And that was the only thing he had ever really been fighting for. The weeks after that hearing were quieter than I expected. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything that mattered was happening behind closed doors, and that silence told me more than any confrontation ever could. Because when someone has spent so long controlling the noise, losing control of silence is devastating. He stopped reaching out completely. No messages, no calls, no carefully worded concern, no accusations, nothing. And that absence confirmed what I already knew, which was that his power had never come from confrontation. It came from shaping the story while other people weren't paying attention. And now that too many people were paying attention, he didn't know how to operate. People around me started filling in the gaps he left behind. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months reached out and said they had always felt something was off, but couldn't put their finger on it. Family members admitted they had questioned their own instincts when they heard his version of things. Co-workers apologized quietly for assumptions they never realized they were making. And here's the part that still hits me the hardest. Every single one of them said the same thing in different words. They said they thought they were helping by staying neutral. Neutrality was what almost erased me. Once the narrative collapsed, everything he had built on top of it began to unravel faster than I expected. Not publicly, not explosively, but in the way reputations actually fall apart in real life. Through hesitation, through quiet distancing, through people choosing not to vouch for you anymore. I didn't need revenge posts. I didn't need dramatic statements. I didn't need to explain myself over and over. The truth didn't need volume anymore. It had witnesses. The formal outcomes came later. Clean, quiet, documents amended, requests withdrawn, records clarified. There was no grand declaration that I was right and he was wrong, because real life doesn't work like that. But what mattered was that the story he had prepared never became the official one. That was the victory. The final confirmation came months later, in the most ordinary way possible. I ran into someone who used to work with him. Someone I barely knew. We made small talk. Then they paused and said something that stopped me cold. They said people were confused about him now. They said his stories didn't line up anymore. They said he seemed angry all the time, like he couldn't understand why things hadn't gone his way. And in that moment, I understood something that took me a long time to fully accept. He didn't lose because I exposed him. He lost because he exposed himself once he no longer controlled the frame. People like him don't need you to attack them. They just need you to stop playing the role they wrote. Looking back, The most terrifying part of all of this wasn't the threats or the paperwork or the hearing. It was how close I came to disappearing quietly. How easily I'd outed myself when someone confident told me I should. How long I protected his image even while he was dismantling mine. If I had stayed silent just a little longer, I might never have gotten my voice back in a way that mattered. That's why I'm telling this now. Not because I need sympathy. But because I know someone listening right now is feeling that same confusion I felt. That slow erosion of certainty. That feeling of being watched and rewritten at the same time. If that's you, hear this clearly. You are not crazy for noticing patterns. You are not unstable for reacting to manipulation. And silence does not protect you when someone else is speaking for you. The day I stopped trying to convince him of my reality was the day I finally got it back. He never apologized. He never admitted anything. He didn't have to. Because the version of me he tried to erase is the one everyone remembers now. And the version of him he tried to sell is the one nobody believes anymore. That's how it ended. Not with revenge. With the truth standing on its own. And him finally having to live inside the story he wrote.